And we continue to shine the spotlight on challenges faced by truck drivers on our roads. Yesterday, I spoke to Siphesihle Muthwa, who is from the National Truck Drivers Foundation. He says drivers are suffering at the hands of owners who are the cause for why they drive recklessly on our roads. And they say this is in order to make deliveries on time. Let's just have a listen to what Mr. Muthwa had to say.
The situation now, it's not like before when the foreign drivers were driving. Our employers, when the foreign nationals were driving here, our employers, they knew that those foreign drivers, they used to go in pairs. They used to go in 2, 3, 4 in one truck. So they can make ETA because if one driver is tired, another one is taking over, but the employer will only pay one driver. So they didn't have any problem because they only pay one driver. Even if it's 4 drivers who are driving the truck, they didn't have a problem. Now, when we as South Africans are driving these trucks, I only drive the truck alone. So now, if you can imagine, I'm driving 15, 16 hours a day and then no rest. There will be accidents.
Joining me for this conversation is the CEO of Road Freight Association, Gavin Kelly, who talks to us via the virtual platform. Mr. Kelly, thank you very much for your time. How do you respond to accusations that truck owners are essentially trying to prove that South African truck drivers are less competent than their foreign counterparts and they are labeled as lazy and poorly trained? Are employers responsible for such bad behavior that we're seeing on our roads?
Good morning, Xoli, and good morning to all your viewers. Right, let's take a look at the first comment made by the previous speaker. If the transport company, the operator, doesn't operate their company in a compliant manner, then you're going to have all these sorts of shenanigans starting to raise their head. So when you employ somebody in the freight industry, there are very, very clear guidelines and rules as to how that person will perform the function for you. When I say guidelines, they're not guidelines, they're actually rules. And those rules are in the first instance set by the Labour Relations Act in general in terms of employees, and then more specifically by the National Bargaining Council for the road freight and logistics industry through the negotiations and the discussions between the employer and the employees, so truck companies who are registered and the unions who represent the employees. That has with it a number of requirements. For example, the maximum driving hours. The minimum hours required that a driver shall rest during those maximum driving hours, and then the maximum amount of driving hours that driver may drive in a 24 and 48-hour period before there are prolonged that are required. They are not voluntary, they are mandatory, they are prescribed periods of rest. So the first thing, and we've been saying this, the Road Freight Association has been saying this for a number of years, is that the non-compliant transporters, those who do not abide by what the labour regulations state, by what the council has set down, by what the representatives of the workers, in this case the drivers, have agreed, those operators must be removed from the sector so that these sorts of accidents, etc., don't happen. And then drivers must remember that where they are employed legally, and part of this rests with the drivers, make sure that your employer in this sector is a legal employer. Then use the various avenues open to you to address these matters. So, for example, going to your union or going to the council to raise these concerns.
All right. Do you know, Gavin, whether the truck owners have made it standard for truck drivers to drive in pairs? Because this came across as being a massive issue especially for the gentleman who spoke before you, who says he speaks for the South African truck drivers. He says the previous situation was that when they drive, they normally drive in pairs or possibly 3 or 4, so that they are able to interchange when the one feels tired, so that they don't cause accidents on the road, but at the same time, they make it on time to the delivery destination.
Well, clearly that's not a general practice. That's not prescribed anywhere. There are a lot of operators who, when their vehicles or their work, their contracts require a long journey or prolonged continuous journeys, will then bring in extra drivers and can then run in shifts and change drivers on these legs or between these legs or during the shifts. So that is not something that is prescribed. It is something that an employer or an operator will decide to do on their own bat. In other words, they will decide in terms of their good governance and in terms of the rules around A, road safety, and B, what the minimum rest periods or maximum driving hours are, whichever way you want to look at it. They will decide, okay, we will have assistant drivers or dual drivers, as some of them call them, in their cabs. But that is not something that is common across the industry at all. It's all about how you manage that driver to ensure that that driver is not fatigued, if this is the case in point.
But how do you make sure, I'm sorry to cut in, how do you make sure that the driver is not fatigued when he is just one driver in the vehicle? I make this example, Gavin, because I would have been, for example, on these long-haul bus routes. As a child growing up, I would be on a Greyhound bus traveling from Durban to Johannesburg, and there normally would be 2 drivers who would change at times because the one feels fatigued. It's a long route. Isn't that the problem? Isn't that the absolute nub of the issue, that if this is not standard practice among the trucking industry, then you ought to introduce it as a standard practice, because one driver on a single route, possibly driving over 24 hours, how do you ensure that that driver is not fatigued?
I see. That's the question. That's the catch. So you could have 2 or 3 people in the cab. How do you know that they are sharing the shifts, for want of a better word? How do you know that driver 1 drove for 8 hours and the second driver then for the next 8 hours, or whatever the case may be? So the first thing to ensure that in actual fact the drivers are rotating, whether it's one person who drives a vehicle and drives it to a point and somebody else gets in and that person gets out, or whether there are 2 or 3 warm bodies in the cab, if you would excuse the expression, you need systems to monitor that. So that's the first thing. You would have either a telematic system linked to where the truck drives, how it drives, and the hours of driving, as well as checking its stops. And you would have a system where the drivers would then input into the system to show it's now Gavin driving, and then a couple of hours later, it's Xoli driving. So that's an important thing, no matter how many guys you put in the cab. The second thing is that you need to ensure there is oversight, so that your supervisors and your managers who look after those drivers, whose job it is to manage those drivers, actually perform those functions to ensure that the resting is happening. Once again, there have been cases where the second driver or the dual driver in the truck actually doesn't get the opportunity to rest as he or she should, and then sometimes there are problems there. So it's really managing the drivers, managing your fleet to ensure that your drivers drive the maximum prescribed hours, not more. If they drive less, that is fine, and ensuring that those rest periods happen. Then there are certain other technologies to test whether the driver is showing fatigue. There are devices that monitor the eyes of the driver and the reactions, which can then send a warning both to the driver and to those who are managing the drivers to get the driver to pull over at a safe place, swap drivers, or rest.
Yeah. All right. Let's take a listen to another accusation, Gavin. Let's just take a listen.
These employers, when we engage them, when we talk to them, they just tell you straight that, hey, you cannot say anything because they've got ministers on their side. Because there are some ministers who have got trucks, And those ministers who have got trucks, they are on the same page with these employers. So that's a work problem we are having in this country.
Gavin, are you aware of government ministers who are involved in the trucking business, whether directly or through family members?
Xoli, I personally don't know about that. Anybody in Parliament or a minister who has a trucking business. They're definitely not members of ours. We've had no indication from any of our members that, listen, this is a minister wherever and in whatever capacity, and we'll do as we like. So the previous speaker needs to bring that sort of information, to us if he wants us to help us. What your viewers must understand is that not every single trucking company in this country is a member of the RFA, and that is one of the issues we've raised with the Minister of Transport, Minister Siphesihle Muthwa. We've said to him, we need as a country to have far better control over who the trucking companies are. They need to have a far more stringent process of being registered. They don't necessarily have to be with the RFA. So no, in terms of that first question, I do not know of a minister who is running a trucking company.
That's a very interesting one indeed. And we clearly have got to have a conversation with the transport minister because you are throwing the ball in his court. But let's conclude the conversation. Moving forward, what role do you think you as the association could play in order to avoid the growing number of accidents we are seeing on the roads, and these accidents caused in the main by truck drivers? Because as things stand now, there is a threat from some communities between the Mpumalanga and KZN routes who feel that the truck drivers are behaving badly on the roads, which is why we saw a gruesome accident like the one we witnessed in Pongola just last month.
Xoli, a very, very, very good question once again. So the first thing that we need to do, as far as the RFA is, we police our members. So we've got 500 odd members out there, and we ensure that they abide by the core code. Some people call it a code of conduct, and in that core code there are various things that our members have to adhere to. One of them is the employment of South African citizens. The second is that whatever processes that they follow in terms of training their drivers, following up on incidents, what people would call accidents, putting in place systems to ensure that the drivers are kept safe in terms of fatigue and various things like that they eat properly, that they are looked after in terms of the routes that they drive, that they are trained on so that they're aware of what sort of risks and hazards are going to be faced during the day or the night. So those sort of processes we can look after in terms of our members. The question is, what happens when a member goes awry? We've got processes for that. What happens when transporters who do not want to, and this is a choice, Xoli, do not want to be registered with council, do not want to follow the regulations? What do we do with them? That's the question. And we've given some suggestions to the minister. We've proposed various ways of dealing with aberrant transporters. And let's hope he takes heed and implements a system that is going to prevent what we saw happening in Upongola a couple of weeks ago.
Gavin Kelly, let me thank you very much for your time.